Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Avid Learning, st+Art India Foundation, and the Ghoda Arts Festival, welcome to Fantasy Architecture. My name is Avid Learning. Fantasy Architecture is a unique lecture demonstration exploring the fantastic and fascinating topic of whimsical architecture and fantasy, weaving in an element of poetry with architect, professor at the Sir J.J. College of Architecture, and poet Mustansir Dalvi. To quote Gaudi, there are no straight lines or sharp corners in nature, therefore buildings must have no straight lines or sharp corners. Fantasy architecture is designed with elements inspired by imaginative themes ranging from theme parks to museums to buildings. It is visually striking and evokes a sense of wonder. It explores new forms of materials, technologies in an inventive and often playful way. We're proud to bring together two iconic and huge festivals of Mumbai, the Mumbai Urban Arts Festival and the Ghoda Arts Festival. Last weekend, on Saturday, we celebrated the opening day of the Ghoda Arts Festival here with a unique panel, a discussion on motifs, materials, and markers of Art Deco architecture. In case you all weren't here, you all can find that on our YouTube channel. And today, we're gathered here to pay a fitting tribute to the end of the next edition of Ghoda, which ends tonight, and delighted to have it hosted here at this wonderful venue. In today's session, Mustansir will take us on a journey of fantastical elements in built structures by examining a broad range of architectural productions that have pushed the boundaries of tradition. So please join me in welcoming our panel, our expert, Professor Mustansir Dalvi, and look forward to a fantastic session. After Mustansir's presentation, he will be taking a few questions, so keep them ready. Thank you, guys. Thank you for being here.
Today is the last day of the Ghoda Festival, so I thought maybe this lecture would be appropriate since it's just fun. Okay, and this is a moment, this is a lecture just to enjoy what you are seeing, because it is almost completely in the realm of ideas, although I will be showing you some actual buildings as well. So, may I just begin? I begin with this very famous quotation from Hamlet, which in one sense encompasses what we are going to see here. Oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. A lot of fantasy and a lot of bad dreams seem to, overlap with each other. And maybe we will see some of the architecture that looks like a nightmare. But like I said, it's part of the larger scheme of things. Let me begin with a very interesting story. In 1884, Sarah Winchester, the widow of the gun magnate William Winchester, the person who developed the Winchester rifle, started adding to a mansion in San Jose, California. She claimed that the mansion was haunted by ghosts of all those who had been killed with Winchester rifles. Under her day-to-day guidance, this mansion started to be reconstructed without interruption until her death in 1922, at which point the work was immediately stopped. This property covered 162 acres. The house was built using a floating foundation, not completely attached to its brick base, with about 161 rooms, 40 bedrooms, 2 ballrooms, 47 fireplaces, 17 chimneys, 2 basements and 3 elevators. There was also only one working toilet. All the other toilets were decoys to confuse spirits. This is also the reason why she slept in a different room every night. So, this building allowed her to move around freely, but under the constant threat, the constant fear of ghosts. And that kind of paranoia led to this kind of architecture, which, at least as far as I am concerned, borders on the fantastic. So, where do we get this word fantasy from? comes from the German fantasien or the Latin fantasia, which actually means to make visible. And fantasy works only on the willingness of somebody to believe in something that is unreal or surreal, and to sacrifice the logic of realism just for enjoyment. And that is what I call upon all of you to do today. Samuel Taylor Coleridge calls fantasy the willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, which constitutes poetic faith, awakening the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom and directing it to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us. So we can look at the notion of fantasy in a variety of different ways, but I think a general common thread should be to keep a largely skeptical mindset and just enjoy it while one is looking at it. We have seen the use of space as fantasy for a very, very long time now. And one of the very interesting examples is, of course, from Dante's 14th century epic poem, The Divine Comedy. This is the Inferno. It tells the story of Dante going through hell, guided by the ancient Roman poet Virgil. So what Virgil does is he proceeds to guide Dante through the 9 circles of hell. These circles are concentric, and they represent from top to the bottom a gradual increase in evil, a gradual increase in wickedness, culminating right at the center of the earth, where Satan is held in bondage. So at every level you find a kind of, these are categorized into sinners of different types, who are all being punished for an eternity fitting their crimes. So Dante gives very vivid descriptions of hell to allow us to willingly suspend our disbelief and share the torments and sufferings, both of Dante as well as those who are stuck in this hell's pit, so to speak. So we see this painting, which is actually, in one sense, a diagram of something going, lower and lower into the deeper pits of hell, and there at the bottom is Satan. Now, if we just inverted this image, we would get another very interesting and fantastical mythical image. This is the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, painted here by Peter Bruegel the Elder in 1563. This painting is now at the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, depicts the construction of the Tower of Babel, which according to the book of Genesis was built by a unified monolingual humanity trying to mark their achievements by building something so tall that it would actually poke heaven. Okay, and this is what it says in Genesis. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves." So what happens is that God is angered by the vanity of the people who think that they can make a tower so tall that it can poke through heaven, and curses them with language. And therefore, each person speaks a different language, and they can no longer communicate with each other, and the whole project collapses. Therefore, it is called the Tower of Babel, and therefore we get words like Babel. So here too, we see an architecture. We saw how hell is in the other direction, heaven is in the other direction, and both have their own interesting stories. Now, J.R.R. Tolkien, in his writing essay on fairy stories, says that the paradigm of secondary belief is based on the inner consistency of reality. If you wish to believe in something, at least within the framework of what you're looking at, it should look real. And anyone who has read The Lord of the Rings and anyone who has seen the movies know how immersive that reality can be. So in his epical books, Tolkien allows us to immerse ourselves into this fantasy universe, even feeling the comfort of home, a Gemütlichkeit in the creation and imagination of the Shire, which is the home of the hobbits. And of course, Bilbo Baggins' home, which is Bag End, and this is a scene from the film, brings to us, enough consistency, and Peter Jackson and his team have done a fabulous job that allows us to experience both the familiar as well as, the strange at the same time. The images, the spaces, and the actions of domesticity as seen in this space, in all the films, wherever this space is shown, is absolutely tremendous. But how can we appreciate an architecture that strains our credibility? And here I show you a real building. This is a building that is actually built. It is in Sopot, Poland, built in 2004, designed by Sotinsky and Zelensky, who were inspired by fairy tale illustrations and drawings of a Jan Marcin stanza and another graphic artist called Per Dahlberg. And what are you seeing here? You are seeing the illustrations of a Swedish graphic designer come to life in this literally crooked house. Some of you may remember a nursery rhyme about the man who lived in the crooked house. And this is that pretty much come to life. But at another part of the world, you have the absolutely fabulous architect Antoni Gaudi and his work in Barcelona, in which he pretty much keeps aside every architectural rule and builds an architecture that is completely unique and completely unusual, even in the context in which he designs. This building, one of his most famous, is the Casa Batlló. It's in the center of Barcelona and one of Gaudi's masterpieces. This was an earlier, older, old-fashioned building, and he has completely remodeled the facade with these very unusual tracery, the stained glass windows, and a large part of the facade is covered with mosaic, broken ceramic tiles. And because of the way in which you see the details of this building, the local name for this building is Casa del Ossos, or the House of Bones. Now, in this same building, this is the roof. I mean, you can see the full building here. If you notice on either side, there are much more conventional types of buildings. The roof is arched. You can see the arch. And there is a reason for that. Because the roof is made to imitate the back of a dragon. You can see the scales of the dragon there. Okay? And it also has a turret and a cross, which represents St. George. St. George is the patron saint of Barcelona and Catalonia, which is Gaudi's home. And the intention is to give the image of St. George slaying the dragon. And so the roof is designed like that. So Asad was talking about poems, so here is my gratuitous, addition of a poem called Casa Batlló. But at the same time, I'll show you some images of this building and another building called the Sagrada Familia, which is the great church in Barcelona, in close-up. And these are images taken by my friend Hemangi Kadu, who is a wonderful photographer. So here is the poem. Casa Batlló. The great reptile gazes down at the deliberate fissure of New Spain. Tinctured scales click in climatic readjustment. Cutting off rays, the sunset scatters over ceramic shards. From his vantage, the Catalonian night measures the cardinal's glance, facing down the next 100 years, seeing much, doing nothing. The disheveled with effort turns, ignoring for a moment the slow ooze, the fulfillment of an uncertain death wish. He stares down ferocious Madrid. Carapace crackling in the heat of the Barcelona sunset, the reptile barely spares a glance at the falling man. Instead, he tightens his scaling grip on the bedrock. His claws append the earth in funicular steadiness. Barcelona gathers to watch. The envoy from Madrid avoids his touch, enters under whitewashed pediments to regular 8-course meals. The cross of Batio, the gecko at Guel, denizens from the sea-swept crags of Mia, half-executed angels from the familia, ignore the man in the torn overcoat, the receding clip-clops of the hit-and-run cart. They have their own agendas and could wait out the martyrdom of another Catalan patriot rather than spare a thought for the decrepit body that lays down in the larger scheme of life. So these images which you have seen are all close-ups of the architectural facade, both of the Casa Batlló and the Sagrada Familia church. Now, I'll take you forward for a little bit of theoretical lecture, if I may. So, Robert Venturi, Dennis Scott Brown, wrote a classic book on architecture called Learning from Las Vegas. And in that lecture, they present this notion of an architecture that looks like something. And very famously, they call it the duck. So if you have a building that looks like something, that is the name for it. It's just a symbol. Very literally, it is an architecture that is whimsical. It is an architecture created by people, mostly not architects, by the common public, to get some immediate kind of response for whatever it is that they are trying to convey. It's a kind of pop whimsy normally built in plaster. So if a building looks like a duck, we can call it a duck. And here is an actual duck from somewhere in the United States. Here is another duck, only this time it is in the form of a kettle. And this is the T-Dome in Washington State, built in 1922. Actually, it's a reminder of a big scandal that took place at that time, which involved a lot of bribery and a lot of senators under the administration of the president, and this represents that. Here is another duck, but this one is from fiction. Jules Verne was probably the inventor of what we now call steampunk, okay, much before the word actually came into popular usage. And one of his least known novels, which is something everyone should read, is a book called Tigers and Traitors. And this is a novel which takes place in India during 1857, right at the heart of the mutiny. And it is during that time that a group of British shikaris, go through the jungles of India trying to kill tigers, and each one is competing with how many tigers they can kill. And the way they go through the jungles of India is in this. This is an invented vehicle run by steam. The elephant is the engine. It's a steam engine. The steam comes out of the trunk. And the two temple-like things behind are the accommodation. And this is how they go through the entire country. Somebody should make a film out of this. This is just from a comic book based on that I used to read when I was 10 years old. And here is another building, also a duck, but this is a real building. This is called the Fish Building. It is the regional office for the National Fisheries Development Board near Hyderabad. This was opened in 2012. So fantasy can be a very literal thing. You know, that if you want it to look like something, you make it look like something. In architecture school, we would rather frown upon these kind of things, but maybe we need to learn also. Let's move to a different type of architecture, which is what we can call visionary architecture, you know, which is you are looking to the future or you're looking beyond yourself. So from a catalog of an exhibition on visionary architecture, this is what it says, that today virtually nothing an architect can think of is technically impossible to realize. We can do pretty much anything. And social usage, which includes economics, determines whether it is visionary or not. So one of the most visionary presentations of architecture ever is probably this one. Okay? This is a dome over Manhattan, which was kind of put forward around 1960 by a very visionary architect called Buckminster Fuller. And Buckminster Fuller does this so that New York's climatic conditions can be controlled. And he uses a very strong visual metaphor to explain why this can actually be made. And you're probably aware that Buckminster Fuller was the one who developed the geodesic dome. This is probably the biggest geodesic dome you could ever imagine. He says a sheet of paper doesn't have any structural strength. But if you just make it curve a little, or you make a cylinder out of that paper, suddenly it becomes strong. You know, it can take weight. If you curve it in two directions, you can get something like this. So this is not an impossible task. Of course, nobody built it, but I'm sure this image was retained in the mind of people, and we find that as a very central image in a very popular novel, which came about 10 years ago, called Under the Dome, by the author Stephen King, whom I'm sure you all know. And in this novel, there is a small town in America that overnight gets covered by a glass dome. Where it comes from, nobody knows. Why it is there, nobody knows. And immediately, that creates an inside and an outside. And the entire story then is based on the politics that emerge when there are people who are within the dome and there is the world outside the dome. And it's a fabulous book to read. But here too, in fiction, and I'll be looking at more fiction later on, you find some of the best depictions of fantasy architecture. Now, coming back to the visionary, this is one of the great unbuilt monuments of all time. This is the monument to the Third International in St. Petersburg. This was designed in 1919 by the Russian architect Vladimir Tatlin and was intended to be like the Communist Party headquarters. This is a huge, huge tower which was built in iron, or to be built in iron and steel and glass, and rose 400 meters into the sky. And within this structure, you had all sorts of things. There was an information center, there was a radio kind of studio, there was a loudspeaker, and parts of this building were rotating, and so on. This image is an influential image for a lot of architects who come later and forms part of what is called the constructivist architecture and the visionary architecture of constructivism. But this building would be realized in some form 100 years later by Anish Kapoor, who designed this ArcelorMittal orbit to celebrate the London Olympic Games. And this is a building just outside one of the stadiums. It's a 114-meter high tower built in steel, and there is an observation tower right at the top over there. And it was the largest piece of public art during the London Olympics, as is obviously evident by its size and scale. Anish Kapoor interestingly said that one of his influences was the Tower of Babel. Okay, so it just shows us how there is a confluence of ideas that comes through it. But he also acknowledged Eiffel and he acknowledged Tatlin, both as influences for the architecture. In the history of Western architecture, there is a period which is very interesting, and it's a period called Futurism. Futurism was an artistic and social movement that originated in Italy in the early 20th century, and it emphasized speed, technology, youth, violence, and fetishized things like the car and the aeroplane and the industrial city. Several of these influences actually later can be seen in Art Deco architecture. Okay, but Futurism obviously was very difficult to carry out, but there were lots and lots of drawings made as futuristic architecture. And this is one of the most famous ones called Città Nuova, or the New City, designed by Antonio St. Elia. Now, the influence of these drawings and the notions of futurism can be seen here. And I think many of you may recognize this image. This is an image from the 1927 film Metropolis by Fritz Lang, and in this film Metropolis, the sets which are designed, they draw inspiration from futurism, from the Bauhaus, from Cubism, and so on. This is a film which was made during the Weimar period, between the wars, and is set in a future, a city, which is like an urban dystopia, and again explores, the up and the down, the rich and the poor, the class differences. But these images where you could see, cars moving at various levels, these kind of flyovers between buildings, aeroplanes flying between buildings, was really visionary for its own time and really fantastic for the audience at that time. This would later influence, in 1982, Blade Runner, which was directed by Ridley Scott, who adapted a novel by Philip K. Dick called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And this, again, is a dystopian vision of Los Angeles in 2019. And all I can say is we are ahead of it now by about 5 years. Here is another image from Blade Runner, and I just wonder whether is this an image of today? It looks like that, isn't it? Novels, especially science fiction novels, have been wonderful places where fantasy architecture has been explored, and I would just recommend 3 of them. The first one is one of my favorites, The Fountains of Paradise by Arthur C. Clarke. This is a story set in the 22nd century and describes the construction of a space elevator. This is interesting because Arthur C. Clarke was actually the inventor, the conceiver of what we call the geosynchronous satellite, which basically means that you put a satellite in space and it stays in the same place as, vis-a-vis the ground. So in that connection, it remains in place and it moves along with the rotation of the Earth, geosynchronous. And Arthur C. Clarke just says that what if we joined that to this, and you would have a space elevator. So you would not need rockets and things like that. You would create an elevator which connected the satellite to the Earth, and you could move goods and people up and down. And of course, what are the consequences of that becomes a very, very enthralling science fiction novel. Another one, which is completely different from this, is by Larry Niven in 1984, a novel called The Integral Trees. And here, the entire environment is biological. An integral tree are free-floating trees in space, which are 50 kilometers from one end to the other. Okay, and the center of the mass of the tree is where people actually live. So there are constant winds which are subjected to both ends, which causes that tree to come into this shape, which is the shape of the integral. Therefore, the name integral trees. And an entire world is created with that. And the third very interesting one is this one by James Blish. It's called Cities in Flight. It's a 4-volume science fiction novel which talks about the invention of some sort of a gravitational device which is given the name Spin Dizzy, which can elevate an entire city off the surface of the earth and go into space. And you have, Scranton, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, New York, Liverpool, Dresden, Saxony, Germany, Budapest, all become independent spaceships, if that is the word, flying about in space and having wars with each other and having a lot of kind of political issues with each other, which is wonderfully written and, evokes the amazing kind of sense of space and space travel while you are still in a familiar environment, like say Manhattan. But here you have Manhattan, which is flying in space. So these become some great evocations of fantasy and fantasy buildings. But I think we should look at some real buildings as well. So let's start with this one. This building is the Bavinger House. This was built in 1955 in Oklahoma by the architect Bruce Goff, who was really a visionary architect of the organic architecture kind of school. The wall was built in a 96-foot logarithmically curved spiral built out of stone, local stone, and the structure was anchored by an oil field drill that was used to make that central mast, and then you suspended the roof from that, so the roof also kind of goes around. But what is interesting is that inside you do not have rooms, but you actually have these floating pods which represent different rooms. So you have a floating pod which is a living room, a floating pod which is a bedroom, and so on. Completely path-breaking for its time. Imagine 1955, okay? And this was such a fantastic thing that it was in fact used in a science fiction film, which also became a big cult film called Barbarella. And this is Jane Fonda in that film, directed by Roger Vadim in 1969. So as you can see, the idea of fantasy goes across media. We don't have to look, we can talk about architecture, we can talk about space, but the way in which it is depicted is not restricted to any one thing. Other buildings which are equally interesting are these. This is a set of housing which is done in Rotterdam. This is called the Cube House, the Cube Houses, designed by the architect Piet Blom. What he does is he takes a normal cube, tilts it 45 degrees, holds it up on edge with a central column, and designs an entire house around it. And if you ask, can this be used as a normal house? I can assure you I can. I have been there. And when you walk around in this place, from the inside, of course, your walls are tilted and so on. But the spaces that are created are perfectly fine and perfectly usable. Another great favorite for most architects is this building. This is in the heart of Prague in the Czech Republic and is popularly called the Fred and Ginger House because it gives the impression of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers dancing. Although it is the National Netherlands building. I think it's a bank building with a very popular restaurant right there on top. So this is a completely non-traditional design designed by the architect Frank Gehry. And what is interesting about this is if you look at the context, look at the buildings surrounding it, and you will find they are old 19th century, neoclassical kind of buildings, and nevertheless, see how well it fits. So fantasy architecture, when realized, and if it is successful, is a very interesting mix of the familiar and the unfamiliar. If it's the familiar, you won't look at it twice. If it is so extremely unfamiliar, it might be out of place. But sometimes you just get the balance right. Okay? And this is one of those. Gaudi, as I have already shown you, was another one who designed buildings that really fitted the bill over there. Then there are some buildings some ideas that lead to other buildings. This is an image from 1785. This is by a very visionary designer architect called Etienne Louis Boulle, who designed this as a grand library. Okay, this was a library for Paris. This was going to be the great national library. And you can see it is designed as a single large barrel vaulted structure with light coming in from the top, monumentally large, with rows and rows of books and a huge interior kind of space. Boulle's designs have always been looked at by architects as ways by which they get inspiration for future buildings. And in fact, you do find it, because here in China in 2017, a library was in fact designed by the architectural firm of MVRDV, which does give you a little bit of Boulle's inspiration, because here too you have these amazing rising stacks from floor to ceiling of bookcases. It's a very undulating kind of space. Light comes in through very, very interesting louvers which come in from the top and create this fantastic kind of architectural space. These are all real structures. Not very far back, this was a very interesting building stroke installation built in New York by Thomas Heatherwick. This has been called the Eiffel Tower of New York, although what it is just a frame of staircases. And the intention was to create this very unusual piece of whimsy right at one of the industrial edges of New York and bring life into that space. From the inside, this is what it looks like. Okay, it consists of 154 flights of stairs, 80 landings, more than 2,000 steps, and does not have any function other than what you are just looking at. You climb up and down that, you get wonderful views of the harbor of New York, and from the outside, it looks like this amazing sculpture that dominates that particular area and creates a great sense of place. I think it is currently undergoing a kind of downturn. There have been already talks of demolishing it. So we'll have to see what happens. We should also look at some visions a bit closer to home. So here is one. This is a design for an Infosys office in Mysore from the early 2000s, designed by the architect Hafiz Contractor. This was an original kind of visionary kind of design. It didn't really happen. What actually got built was something like this, which is also in one sense slightly unusual, but much more buildable, shall we say. Another one of Hafiz Contractor's designs that never got built was this one. This was intended to be in the early 2000s again, the design for the tallest building in the world. And this was supposed to come up in Gurgaon. But of course, we haven't seen it. As you can see, it is visionary, it is fantastic, perhaps too fantastic for us to carry out maybe in the early 2000s. Let me show you another fantastic design which is quite interesting. And it is this one. This is a design created in 2003 by a very visionary design firm who locates itself completely in environmental design called SITE. And it's architect James Wines. I don't know whether you recognize it, but this is in the very spot of Antilla. And this is my kind of cheap cut and paste, taking that design and sticking it on where Antilla should have been, or is in fact. Now, in 2003, SITE was actually commissioned by the Ambanis to make a design for Antilla. And this is the design they gave them. And what James Wines says that at the time SITE was working for both the Ambani brothers in Mumbai, neither client seemed to know exactly what they wanted. Here are some other images of the insides of that building. Mukesh Ambani commissioned a house in the sky with a garden, since there is not enough garden space in the city. And we thought it might be interesting to create a series of parks in the sky, which we called a vertiscape. And of course, Wines says with some regret that it didn't get through. It was probably just not understood by the clients. But I imagine this in place of Antilla. I think we would have had something more interesting to talk about if this building had actually come up. Now, let me end by talking about a project that skirts the line of fantasy. In fact, this is a building called The Line, and it is a futuristic mega project that is due to come up in Saudi Arabia. This is a single building, 170 kilometers long, which goes across the body of the nation of Saudi Arabia, starts in the middle of the desert and ends right at the Gulf of Aqaba near the Red Sea. This is a pet project of the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and is designed as two parallel skyscrapers that are encased with mirrors on all sides. Okay, and between those two skyscrapers, you have an outdoor space in between. That total width in between them is 200 meters, and the total height of the building is 500 meters, which goes for 170 kilometers. And it is intended to be entirely powered by renewable energy. It is designed to have no cars, no streets, no carbon emissions. This is a building that has been designed to house 9 million people. It will consist of layers for pedestrians, underground infrastructure, other forms of transportation. Artificial intelligence is intended to monitor the city and use predictive data models to improve the life of the people who are living in that. These are two images from between the two parallel walls. The estimated cost of this building is around $200 billion, although some estimates say that it may go as high as $1 trillion. Already 12 international firms have been hired to take care of sections of this building, which include international practices like Adjaye Associates, Morphosis, Studio Fuxas, and Coop Himmelblau. Now, this is probably the ultimate whimsical, fantastic kind of building that you can think of. But understand this, excavations for this building already commenced in 2022, and it is a building slated to be completed by 2030. So, whether this building succeeds or whether it fails will all happen in your lifetime. So keep an eye out for it. So that is more or less my presentation for today. Thank you very much for being a lovely audience and listening to what I had to present. And I do hope that you have enjoyed it and it has, whet your appetite for an architecture that is out of the ordinary. Thank you so much.
Do you all have any questions? Mustansir will take a few.
Sir, in this field, fantasy architecture, where our country stands? Because
yeah, I have already shown you Indian examples.
one example
in
you
that.
shown.
There are a few, not too many, but I'm sure since we are now a rapidly developing country, we will have more whimsical things like this in our country as well. As long as there are people to pay for it, it'll come up.
So Mustansir, I just thank you for this wonderful presentation. I just sent you and Kobe 2 images. I think one thing you have to add to your presentation is the Qatar Museum, the Qatar National Museum, which is built like the desert rose, which I've been to. And and even in Saudi, they have a symphony hall, which is full glass. So all you see is the desert. I sent you that image also just now. But thank you very much. I've always been a fan of Mustansir's presentation, especially this one. He had done this in Goa a few years ago. And I thought, what a fantastic location to get this for a second round, in here. So thank you for being here. I know it's a Sunday morning. It's a little difficult. Thank you to all our partners, the Mumbai Urban Arts Festival and their team, the Ghoda Arts Festival, and the Avid Learning team. Today is the last day of the Ghoda Arts Festival, so I suggest you guys go check out. There's some amazing programs towards the end of the evening also. There's the reunion of colonial cousins, which is going to happen at Cross Maidan. Obviously, Start is going to be on for a couple of weeks more. But I suggest, since you all are here, kind of go check out some of the buildings. It's really a wonderful initiative, and we're very glad to be a part of this festival and program for it. The next program we have out here is on Wednesday, that Avid is curating, is a dance fusion performance with Gayatri Chapati Sharma. And on Saturday, we have a children's workshop called Jal Tirang, which is music through water. And as you all may know, the theme of this year's festival is water and the bazaar. But thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Mustansir, for being such a supporter of everything that we do. And have a wonderful rest of the Sunday. Thank you.